schedule. What?
I'm just going to say again, everyone should be muted, but it looks like some of you folks coming in are either not muted or have unmuted yourself. So if you're not a speaker, if you could mute yourself, that would be helpful so that we don't have background noise or feedback or anything that's happening from other folks' conversations and that sort of thing. So yeah, it looks like some of you guys aren't muted and some of you I can't mute for some reason. So if you're not muted, you can mute yourself. We'd really appreciate it. Okay, we can get started. So I'm Alexis Wagoner. For anyone who doesn't know me, I work with Westar as the Marketing and Digital Education Director. And I just wanted to say a few words about what and who Westar is for anyone who may be joining us that doesn't know. So we are an organization that has a couple of different components. Our main goal is to bridge the gap between the scholarship of religion and the public, and we do that in a variety of different ways. One main way being that we have a number of scholars that we work with that are members with us, and they work collaboratively on different projects and ideas and in seminars and doing a bunch of different research and that sort of stuff. And then with the goal of bringing that all to the public in ways that are accessible and interesting and attainable to folks that are non-scholars but are interested in this scholarship of religion endeavors. So one of the ways that we do that is through books. So I think that this book that we're talking about tonight, Doing Theology in the Age of Trump, is a wonderful example of this sort of gap bridging happening. Scholars that are writing for the public and folks that are engaging with this work as a topic that is very relevant today. And then this sort of roundtable thing being another thing that we do as a way to get our scholars directly in contact with the public and with folks like you who are interested in asking questions and engaging further on these topics that, again, I think are becoming more and more important to us in these times that we live in. So there are a couple of ways that you all can be further involved with us if you're not already. We do offer membership, and so one of the incentives that we're doing is if you join as a member, if you're not already, from today through the end of the week, so through Saturday, if you join, we have two different membership options at a $10 level, and I'm going to share my screen here so you can see more info, but we have a $10 level and a $5 level, and if you join at the $10 a month level, then you'll get a free copy of the book. And if you join at the $5 a month level, we'll send you a chapter of the book, which is also wonderful as well. So as incentive, that's just an incentive that we're offering. And then some of the perks of being members are other talks like this that we do exclusively for our members with scholars one-on-one. So we actually have a handful coming up in August in relation to this specific topic. We're going to be talking further with Hollis. We're going to be talking with Sarah Maurice Brubaker, who also contributed to this book, and with Jack Caputo, who also contributed to this book. And then we have programming throughout the rest of the year from there that continues in that vein, but on different topics. So, and that's just a little plug for some of the other stuff that we do. So in terms of the roundtable tonight, I'm going to introduce our scholars, and then I will turn it over to them to let them say a little bit more about themselves, a little bit more about the work in general, and then their work specifically as related to this book. So Jeff is going to kick us off, and Jeffrey Robbins is Chair and Professor of Religion and Philosophy at Lebanon Valley College in Pennsylvania, and then following him, I think we'll have Clayton Crockett, and he is the Professor of Philosophy of Religion at the University of Central Arkansas. And then finally, Hollis will wrap us up, and he is an Assistant Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Mercer University. And then after each of them have gotten a chance to talk, then we'll probably do a little bit of dialogue amongst ourselves and then open it up for Q&A. And probably the way we'll do that is just to do a chat. So once we get to that point, I can talk a little bit more about that. So before I go on any further, Jeff, I will turn it over to you. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Alexis. And thank you, everyone who's joining us tonight in advance of the second night of the Democratic presidential debates. I'm sure everyone's eagerly awaiting that. I was told that I can say a few words about the God Seminar, who we are, and how it relates to Westar. Many people know about Westar because of the Jesus Seminar. but what people might not know is that since the time of the Jesus Seminar, which did such groundbreaking research on the historical Jesus, Westar has continued to sponsor ongoing academic seminars that are collaborative, that are cutting edge, that draw onto the best of religious scholarship. And about 5 or 6 years ago, in addition to the history of Christianity, or Christian Origins Seminar, the God Seminar was started. And Clayton and I and Hollis as well have been part of that pretty much since its inception. And we've been exploring some of the most kind of interesting and compelling and challenging ways about thinking about God for the 21st century over the past 5 years. We are currently kind of wrapping up a phase of our research that has been devoted to what we call the varieties of post-theism, kind of getting rid of the kind of idea, or once we are no longer satisfied with the kind of big daddy, kind of transcendent superpower God associated with traditional Orthodox Christianity, what other ways can we talk about God, conceive of God, and imagine God? And so that's pretty much been the work of the God Seminar over the past 4 or 5 years. And we are now transitioning our work to thinking about the human future, not only new conceptions of God, but also how theology might speak to new ways of thinking about what it means to be human, how we care for the earth, the relationship between religion and politics, and things like that. And unlike the Jesus Seminar, the Christianity Seminar, the God Seminar is comprised primarily of, I guess, theologians, philosophers of religion, critical theorists, and many of the people who contributed to this particular volume, Doing Theology in the Age of Trump, are involved in the God Seminar in one fashion or another. And part of our commitment, which is consistent with the mission of Westar, is to try to translate our scholarship to the public at large, and to consider ways that our scholarship might be relevant to the kind of challenges facing the world today. So obviously, we, if you've read the book, or if you're familiar with the book, we consider Trumpism to be one of the challenges that we face in the world today. We think it's a dangerous political force, but it also makes use of kind of religion in the most kind of virulent ways. And we're trying to kind of challenge the ways by which, or I guess we're trying to sort of raise questions about what we can learn from the kind of popularity of Trump, the success of Trump, and think about ways we might sort of think about God and religion differently in light of the phenomena of Trumpism. So what I'd like to do is briefly talk about, I guess, my way of conceiving of this project originally, and sort of my specific contribution to the book. And then I'm going to turn it over to Clayton and Hollis, and hopefully we'll have some time for discussion after that. To begin, I want to refer to a recent piece that was published in the Atlantic Monthly that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with already. And it was a piece called "The Deepening Crisis in Evangelical Christianity" by Peter Weiner. And Peter Weiner is a Republican activist. He was part of President Bush's kind of faith-based initiatives. And he wrote a pretty scathing article about the ways by which evangelicals have done kind of mental and spiritual gymnastics in their support of Trump and the phenomena of Trumpism. He quotes Ralph Reed, famous for the Christian Coalition, as saying, "There has never been anyone who has defended us and who has fought for us, who we have loved more than Donald J. Trump? No one. And again, that's Ralph Reed talking about Donald Trump. Another pro-Trump figure reports from a recent rally in Orlando, Florida for Trump. Quote, "I have never witnessed the kind of excitement and enthusiasm for a political figure in my life. I honestly couldn't believe the unwavering support they have. They believe that the Trump movement is spiritually driven and that Trump is God's chosen leader." And again, from Weiner, "The enthusiastic, uncritical embrace of President Trump by white evangelicals is among the most mind-blowing developments of the Trump era. How can a group that for decades, and especially during the Bill Clinton presidency, insists that character counts and the personal integrity is an essential component of presidential leadership, not only turn a blind eye to the ethical and moral transgressions of Donald Trump, but also constantly defend him? Why are those who have been on the vanguard of family values so eager to give a man with a sordid personal and sexual history a mulligan?" End quote. And a couple more quotes here. "Many evangelical Christians are filled with grievances and resentments because they feel they have been mocked, scorned, and dishonored by the elite culture over the years. For them, Trump is a man who will not only push their agenda on issues such as the courts and abortion, he will be ruthless against those they view as threats to all they know and love. For a growing number of evangelicals, Trump's dehumanizing tactics and cruelty aren't a bug. They are a feature. Trump owns the libs, and they love it. He'll bring a Glock to the cultural knife fight, and they relish that." Okay, so those are just some quotes about like the idea of the kind of thing that puzzles so many of us. Why is it that especially white evangelicals are so willing and eager to turn a blind eye to the various offenses of Trump with their own kind of personal sense of piety? And Weiner goes on to basically say that this is not just bad for the country, but especially in his mind, from a religious perspective or theological perspective, it's really bad for Christianity. The whole point of his article is that evangelicals are losing a whole generation of future disciples or followers or adherents because of Trump's offenses. That Trump is giving evangelicalism a bad name. And the point Weiner's trying to make, or the argument that he makes in light of that, is that evangelicals need to kind of take back sort of evangelical Christianity from Trump. They need to sort of purify themselves. They need to basically expel sort of
where is this chicken?
Trump and Trumpism. This is a piece from Atlantic Monthly. And what I want to sort of point out is it's just, I want you to notice the kind of point of intervention that Peter Weiner has. His concern, and I think this is absolutely crucial, is not with the damage that is done in the name of Christianity, but instead, his primary concern in this piece is the damage being done to evangelical Christianity. So his effort is to restore Christianity's good name, more than marshaling the moral force of evangelicals to, for instance, the plight of the immigrant, the refugee, or the care for the earth. He's concerned about sort of making sure evangelicals aren't sullied with the reputation of Trump. So even after the complicity of evangelicals with white power is revealed, there's reluctance, a circling of the wagons, a refusal to see what is so obvious with those with eyes to see. And this sort of is where my own piece, and I think the point of this book, really rests. For us, the point is not to restore or to rehabilitate Christianity. Our effort's not to kind of restore evangelical Christianity's good name. But instead, our effort is to marshal the forces of resistance against this. And And my piece, my article in our introduction talks a lot about sort of how we might conceive of resistance, so that politics is not seen as a kind of zero-sum game. But for our purposes here tonight, what I want to talk about sort of real briefly is just what this means for doing theology differently. Like the point is, how can we learn from this moment so that we can think about God in a new way, a more productive, a more healthy way? And I want you all to consider the resonance between Trump's signature slogan, "Make America Great Again," and the logic of the reforming spirit of Protestantism. The impulse of both is to go back to a golden age when things were simpler and purer. But what do we know about the actuality of those previous times? Whether it's a question of the time of our founding fathers or the first centuries of Christian history. These too were times of contestation and conflict, of power and privilege, where wide swaths of people based on their beliefs or their gender or their race were systematically silenced. So what I'm suggesting here is, can we not see the Reformation spirit of Protestantism then as an effort to make Christianity great again? The same logic is at work. And there's something problematic about that logic in itself. So how can we do theology differently? My argument is that we look to transformation rather than reformation. That we get over the orthodox mentality of restoring right beliefs and embrace instead a kind of heterodoxical mentality that claims the right to think God differently. After all, sort of as Jesus told us, as quoted in Mark chapter 2, humanity was not made for the Sabbath, but Sabbath for humanity. And so whether we're talking about making America great again or making Christianity great again, this kind of fundamentally restorative mentality is problematic for opening sort of ways, new and different ways to thinking about God in the 21st century. We'll come back to that later, but I want to sort of turn our time over to Clayton and Hollis now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. And I want to endorse everything Jeff said and say that we had a sort of a panel discussion on this sort of question of Christian nationalism in the time of Trump, in the Trump era, and then we edited that into a book to address all of these kinds of things. And specifically the idea of theology as resistance and thinking about what are the tools both to understand what's happening as well as how can we resist. And so I think that what we call evangelical Christianity or the religious right, notwithstanding the actual sort of integrity or sincerity of many of the believers, is as a whole a result of a kind of a political manipulation, a cultural construct. And in some ways, we could think about the Southern strategy that was developed for Richard Nixon's presidency in the wake of the Civil Rights Movement, which would capture white Democrats for the Republican Party. And it's not just the South as a geography, but we could think about the South as a kind of cultural ideal, and again, a specifically white cultural ideal that substitutes for this country and this United States. And so one of the pieces in the book by Catherine Keller at Drew University talks about this idea of Fox Angelicals in terms of evangelicals, in terms of Fox News, and how much of Fox News shaped and is still shaping the worldviews of these Christians, and the mutability, the changeability that Jeff mentioned, right? So that Trump is now seen as one of us, even though he betrays all of the beliefs, or many of the core beliefs, the crucial core beliefs that they would have said would have been absolutely fundamental to being a conservative evangelical Christian. And it becomes less about beliefs, a bit less about belief in this or that, less about doctrines, dogmas, even though they get thrown around, and more about a kind of cultural contestation, a kind of the intensification of the country into camps of an us and them mentality. And this has been used by both parties, certainly more so by the Republican Party, but the Democrats fall into this as well. The idea that as long as you can divide the American people into two opposing sides, and then the politicians, the races, right, are 51-49, or as close as you can to even, one side gets a little bit more, and again, it's usually the Republicans, not always, but then that becomes a kind of a manipulation in a way to sort of distract from what's happening under this, which is the economic aspect. And so one of the things that I do in my essay, one of the things I like to talk about is I like to use the F word, fascism, and think about fascism beyond the sort of the controversy. I mean, it's a knee-jerk kind of reaction around this word fascism, but carefully think about, delineate, and even define something that I want to call American fascism. And so the word fascism comes from the Latin originally, the fasces, F-A-S-C-E-S, which means bundle. It's a bundle of sticks bundled together. And this was used in ancient Rome. And if it was used in a kind of a warlike military way, it would have an axe and an axe blade on top of this. Okay, so we have a certain sort of fasces in the United States Congress, but without the axe. And so if we think about fascism as a kind of a bundling or a bundling together of different elements, and I would want to distinguish three that are bundled together in uneven ways that work together, reinforce each other, and in ways that are destroying us. They're literally killing us because they're killing this planet. And so the first would be what I talked about, this kind of brutal Southern white Christianity, which is shaped by a certain kind of racialism and racism, whether it acknowledges this or not. Certainly Trump appeals to this with the dog whistles. And this is a result of this Southern strategy. This is a result of the cultivation of a certain kind of cultural identity for evangelical white Christianity. And this is one of the visible components that we're looking at and talking about when we get to Trump and Trumpism. The second, which we also treat, explore, go into depth in this book about, is this idea of American exceptionalism and nationalism. The idea that the United States is a country blessed by God. And again, the colony and the nation of the United States, the settler colony that becomes the United States as a result of the genocidal destruction of the native peoples and then the importation and slavery of African peoples. It's based on those two exclusions. And this American exceptionalism and nationalism has a theological religious resonance that fits, not always exactly, not completely, but resonates powerfully with this understanding of evangelical Christianity that we're talking about. And then finally, the third element, which I think is under-thematized in the book and sometimes underappreciated by many of the opposition, people that oppose and want to resist Trump, is what we could call corporate capitalism. And so if we're thinking about corporate capitalism, which is not nationalistic, which is not necessarily evangelical, but can manipulate and use and draw and benefit from both of these phenomena in various ways. And what's happening below the culture wars is this massive ongoing transfer of wealth from poor to rich. And this has happened in this country, this has happened around the world for the last 30 to 40 years. And it's staggering, the concentration of income. And it's not just the 1%, which is the slogan of the Occupy movement, it's the 0.001%. It's as you get further and further and closer to the top, the more and more of the wealth of the entire world is being concentrated in fewer and fewer hands in order to sustain that growth and that concentration, we're all losing. And if you take seriously human life, if you take seriously a planet and Earth, a world to live in, then we have to confront that and we have to address that. And so I'm just trying to think about tools and concepts and ways to analyze and think about the way these three things can constitute something that we can call American fascism, and then think about ways maybe it's possible to resist that, possibly to take it apart. And so I'll stop there with that and turn it over to Hollis. So,
okay, thanks, Clayton. And I'll reiterate a lot of what Jeff and Clayton have already said. But my essay, which I wrote with Jordan Miller, treats Trumpism, as we've been talking about, as an overall state of affairs. So the problem isn't concentrated in one person named Trump or even his cabinet, to extend it just a little bit. Trump, in a lot of ways, is the culmination of a lot of different processes, and that's the way we treat it. So we've already talked about it's the culmination of economic processes with the rise of neoliberalism, as Clayton was saying, the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands. Also, it's the culmination of racial politics and animus in the United States, but also globally, as you can see with far-right movements in other countries, such as Brazil, for instance. And I mean, Trump doesn't bring racism to the table as this novel thing that we had gotten rid of, and now it's finally here again. It's just he allows it freedom to bubble up. It's always been there. And now it's rearing its head very publicly again. But also it's the culmination of religious processes or religio-political processes. And that's what I want to talk about just a little bit in more detail, especially in relation to, as we've already mentioned, evangelicalism. Kirsten Powers wrote an editorial maybe 2 or 3 years ago saying that Donald Trump had fleeced evangelicals and sort of tricked them. But my read on it is that evangelicals knew what they were doing all along, and Trump didn't so much use them as evangelicals used Trump. In other words, they saw an opportunity to get what they wanted, and they were willing to throw their hats in with Trump. And a lot of the narrative focuses on, as Jeff was talking about with Peter Wiener, but also Jonathan Merritt uses this narrative, and virtually all of the commentary on evangelicalism uses the sort of personal moral virtue narrative, that Trump is out of step with so-called evangelical values, family values, character, and so it's odd that evangelicals would support them. But my read on evangelicalism is that this has been going on all along, right? The moral language is a cover for the political language. And evangelicals are always willing to throw their hat in with anyone as long as they can get what they want, right? And what do they want? Well, they want to outlaw abortion, and they want to go back on civil rights for LGBTQ persons, and they want to cover all this under the idea of religious freedom. That's sort of what's going on right now, and that's why they voted for him. It was no big secret, I don't think. It wasn't surprising, and it's consistent with evangelical politics for the last 30 or 40 years. And I think that when we're analyzing Trumpism, and especially the relationship to evangelicalism, we just need to wake up and be honest and say the evangelicals won. I know there are all these narratives out there that point to the decline of evangelicalism, demographic shifts, how evangelicals have lost a generation. That narrative goes back to the 1980s, though. We've been saying this since the 1980s, and clearly it hasn't materialized. And so we need to take the risk and say evangelicals won, and they really have, because they have the court locked up, and that's what they wanted. The Supreme Court is locked up potentially for at least a generation. if not more. And so that's the reality that we need to deal with. And we also need to deal with the fact that because of that, Trumpism extends beyond Trump itself. The trajectories that are in place, even Trump-specific policies, aren't simply going to go away if we elect a Democrat to take the Oval Office against Trump. These trajectories are in place, the cultural forces are in place, the economic forces are in place. And so really what we need is a radical shift of perspective, which I think Clayton and Jeff were already talking about as well. And so I think we need to deal with Trumpism, and especially the religious aspect of it. We need to drop a lot of the common critiques that get thrown around at evangelicals, but also at Trump. These sort of gotcha style critiques, where, just to think, Trump's comments about Baltimore, how it's, rat infested. And then there are all these articles, well, who owns all the properties in Baltimore, Kushner. Well, I mean, Trump doesn't care and his base don't care either about that. So it's sort of preaching to the choir in a lot of ways. Or the hypocrisy argument that evangelicals are being hypocritical when they support Trump over against their values. That assumes that evangelicals are going to have some sort of change of heart if we point out what's quote unquote right to them. They haven't and they won't, and we need to drop the narrative of a true Christianity over against false Christianity. Whether we like their theological positions or not, these people claim to be Christians, and we need to deal with that honestly and rather ask the question, how does this emerge out of Christianity? Because horrible political movements are no stranger to Christianity and its history, as I'm sure we all know. And so just to conclude quickly, and we can talk about some of this more hopefully in a bit more detail, I think we need to have a radical change of perspective. And I think we need to deal with the fact that we're on different terrain, and we have to have a theological and religious thought, but also a political and economic thought that breaks out of this condition that we're in. And that condition extends well beyond Trump, and it extends well beyond the Republican Party as well. And so it's not just confined there. And with that, I'll go ahead and stop talking for now.
Thanks, Hollis, and thanks, everybody. So yeah, I think that I have a few questions of my own, and then as you have questions too, for those that are listening, if you want to just type them in the chat box, then I will try and integrate them as we go. But one of the things I also wanted to lift up, and Hollis, you kind of hit on it there, but when I saw you all do your presentation at Wild Goose and heard Karen talk, one of the things that really struck me, and you all kind of, I think, get at it in one way or another in your essays, but the thing that she really hit on was this idea of creating these extremes, like these false dichotomies, kind of, that it's really easy to put everything that we would consider terrible over on this complete extreme side of things and lump evangelicals over there and say it's all, it's extreme misogyny, extreme racism, extreme homophobia, whatever the extreme is. And then everything else is over here and it's good. And therefore it's easy to then place ourselves in this other side of the spectrum where we're good. And so we don't have to examine what's in between, that not all folks fall on the really bad side and that not all of us fall on the really good side. And where is that in between that we have to wrestle with? And like Hollis, you were saying, the relationships with the fact that, these people are still calling themselves Christian, and where do we fit in those relationships and that dynamic, and things like that. And so I just wanted to put that out there as something that has been really important for me to think about, having come out of the evangelical tradition and having a tendency to just be like, ugh, like vilify everything. And therefore I must be great because I'm over here now. And then also, so just put that out there and see what you guys had to say, if anything, and then let you guys talk amongst yourselves for a little bit as well, if you had anything you wanted to say in response to each other's presentations.
Yeah, I mean, if I can start real quick, I think much of what you're touching on, Alexis, is, I think, goes to the point Hollis was making, and this notion that you can somehow distinguish or differentiate between true Christianity and false Christianity, or good Christianity and bad Christianity. Or, to put it differently, this whole kind of myth of innocence that we all operate under. For many, and I think especially for evangelical Christians, the idea of kind of innocence, of the meaning of grace and forgiveness, sort of washing us clean of sin, in some ways severs us from our past, suggests that we in no way are kind of burdened by the structural inequities or structural racism that sort of persists within our culture. And I think that's a damaging and dangerous form of theology, or a dangerous and damaging form of religiosity. It's not to say that it's not Christian. It's not to say that my reading of Scripture is necessarily sort of the right one over against this wrong one. But it is to say, so long as we persist in this myth of innocence, how does that allow us to kind of occupy this space in which we turn a blind eye to the suffering of our fellow human beings, and the way in which that's done by preying on the kind of theology at work in our various political movements. So I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that the political mobilization of the religious right is wrapped up in racial politics, or specifically white nationalism. I mean, that's detailed in several chapters of this book. The kind of resonances and the kind of correlations and the kind of symmetry of the rise of the religious right, and the kind of effort to kind of repudiate or undo much of the gains won under the civil rights movement. I think that's undeniable. But I think sort of white, liberal, mainline Protestant Christians have to do a lot of soul searching with regard to the ways in which they think that somehow they're not complicit in these kind of structures of power that allows this to go on kind of unchallenged.
Yeah, and that's where, Jeff, you talked about, like, it's not the right strategy to try to purify Christianity, to reach back to a certain place of origin before everything got corrupted, because that very logic is problematic here, and sort of maintains this myth of and temptation of innocence. Also, the way that we might want to demonize Trump and Trump's supporters, right, as a basket of deplorables, as Hillary Clinton said, is a whole strategy of political demonization on both sides. And it's not usually about liking or feeling comfortable or necessarily embracing sometimes your candidate, but making the other person seem more dangerous, more hated. I mean, the vilification of Hillary Clinton, unbelievable. And the misogyny involved in that was also incredible during this election. Sorry, I was just going to say one more thing. And I think that reflexivity is important, and I think that we need to think about the ways in which the individualization, the atomization of human beings in the logic of Christianity, and specifically evangelical Christianity, in terms of personal salvation, where it's all about my salvation, my relationship to God, and I don't care about anybody else. I don't care if Hollis goes to hell or Jeff goes to, actually I know Hollis is going to hell. But how that resonates with the practices of consumer capitalism, which constructs and maintains and reinforces a similar kind of individualism and isolation, because it's all about my, goods, my reinforcing my own sense of self. And if I get the right product, I drive the right car, if I read the right books, then I'm going to be a better person. But it's not about connections and community with other people or other species. Go ahead, Scott. Sorry.
Yeah, and I was just going to say, this is why I'm skeptical of the religious left or the Christian left as well, or at least the calls for renewal of it. I mean, there's always been a Christian left working behind the scenes, but you have recently a call to try to mobilize it. But again, this goes back to the 1980s. Jim Wallace back in the 1980s talked about the rise of the Christian left to rival the religious right at the national level. And it didn't happen, and I don't see why it's going to happen now. But I think, and I don't think it really needs to happen, because those who identify as left aren't going to vote against the left anyway, probably. So you don't need to necessarily use religion as a mobilization tool the same way the right does. But I also think it's problematic just because it plays into this idea of distinguishing a true from false Christianity. So, well, the religious right has hijacked these concepts, and we will assert the real ideas of Christianity. But again, as Jeff was saying, it fails to own up to the structural issues that liberal Christians find themselves occupied in, but also have benefited from in the same way that people on the right have.
Hollis, there's a couple questions for you. One is probably a long answer. I don't know if you can give a condensed version of this, but how did Christians get sorted into this current version of evangelicalism that we're seeing? That's like a dissertation subject, but and then if you could expand on how to demonstrate kind of that shift in perspective that you were talking about.
Yeah, I mean, well, at least the current form of evangelicalism, I think you can trace back. I mean, it goes back before that, but I mean, I would sort of isolate it to the late 70s. With the emergence of an explicit religious right and the rise of the moral majority movement. And that also, sees a lot of processes come into play as far as neoliberalism, but also it's a reaction to racial politics, to abortion politics. And the whole point in that movement is to, as Jeff was saying, make Christianity great again, but also make America great again, right? Jerry Falwell was saying we need to rescue the country and bring it back to its, Christian roots. And for him, that involves, abortion politics, but also that's a cover for racial politics and segregation. And so I think it's traced back to there, and I think it's the same trajectory in that way, and it's still a dividing line for people. The abortion question, where you are on gay rights, for evangelicals, that determines who's in and who's out. That's why evangelicals, no matter what, probably most of them could never vote for Hillary Clinton, even though she is a Christian. The reason is because they see her as unreachable. In other words, she claims to be a Christian, but supports abortion rights and LGBTQ rights and so on, and she hasn't changed her mind. She's completely unreachable. And the unreachable who have heard the gospel through evangelicals are destined to hell, if they've heard it, right? As far as a change of perspective, I think that's a lot more difficult to do. I think there are political movements that are trying to do these sort of shifts in perspectives as far as organizing differently. Occupy was one example of a way to organize differently. You also have church movements that are trying to organize differently. One of my friends, and he's not the only one, but it's just on my mind, John Thornton has just started a new church in Durham called Jubilee Baptist Church that is solely focused on debt forgiveness and workers' rights, a way to mobilize workers. I think that's one way you shift perspective as far as giving power back to the people. But I think ultimately too, we need to start thinking heavily about shifting our perspective in relation to climate change, or we're all going to go to hell. So.
And Hollis, I just want to put a plug out for your co-author and what you were just talking about with regards to the Occupy movement. He just has a new book out, as we know, Resisting Theology, Furious Hope, in which he looks at the Occupy movement as this new means, a new way of organizing communities, and tries to interrogate that from a kind of political theological perspective. So some of the listeners out there might be interested in that work by Jordan Miller. And I also want to commend the chapter by Dan Miller, because I see a lot of the comments that people are offering up in the chat room about this kind of question of beliefs and the way in which Trump clearly doesn't, abide by the belief system of evangelicalism, but yet sort of evangelicals are so eager to support him. Dan Miller's chapter very much sort of looks at evangelical politics, not from the perspective of beliefs, but from the perspective of identity, specifically a kind of tribal identity. And I think we, because of the prominence of belief in Protestant Christianity, we get so caught up on looking at that as the marker of authenticity. It's interior beliefs that matter most to so many Protestant Christians, and they look at these political movements and they lose the forest for the trees because they're thinking exclusively in terms of beliefs. But if we shift our perspective in terms of tribal identities, things are no longer as confusing as they appear to be. Things begin to make a lot more sense.
So there's been a few kind of questions in this vein, and I always think it's helpful as we turn toward the last 15 minutes or so here to think in practical terms. And so I guess to kind of maybe hit on a few things that have been put forth, like, what are your all's thoughts on how to have these conversations? I mean, first of all, we have to do like the recognition amongst ourselves and within ourselves of where we are in the spectrums and shifting our thinking and all that sort of stuff. But then for a lot of folks, myself included, we have family, people we care about and so forth that are still in these demographics and that we're still in contact with. So I'd love to hear any practical theology tips from you all about those types of conversations and how to facilitate that in the larger community and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I'm looking at this question from Donna Green about the religious right as a unified voice, and progressive liberal Christians are many efforts and voices, and that diversity marks what we think of as progressive and liberal. And so to say, how can progressives unify resisting American fascism? In some ways, the fascism is that unification. And in some ways, that's what we, when I say we, the members of the God Seminar and maybe other progressive, religious and political folks would want to avoid. And there's this weird kind of, I guess, sometimes on the left, this kind of like, we wish we could be as unified, as strong, as ruthless as the right. And yet if you are, then you become what you want to oppose. And so there's that danger. And at the same time, maybe sometimes you have to recognize that you have to take these risks. And I'm thinking of, like, again, creating new coalitions, not just within the church or churches or Christian groups or religious groups, but religious and secular. Hollis mentioned Occupy. We get trapped into these binaries. We get trapped by thinking in these terms. And so I'm thinking specifically of Antifa and the Antifa handbook. And I'm thinking about, again, the coalitions that come together to resist fascism and neo-Nazis. And I'm thinking about strategies and tactics and practices by people involved in the Jewish social justice movement, because most of these people, if they're politically aware, if they're socially aware of what's going on, they know what it means to be targeted. And they know that a lot of this racism is also thinly veiled anti-Semitism, and they know what it means to organize and resist in very concrete and practical terms. And I think Christians and others need to be talking to people that are socially aware and involved in these kinds of things, as well as many others. I mean, it's just, there's all these, there's all this diversity, there's all this possibility, you're not going to get the unity, but to create the resonance and the connections and allow for the possibility for something different, something resistant to emerge.
I'll just jump in and say I think that we also have to recognize that there's a certain percentage of people on the right that are going to stick to the right both politically and religiously, no matter what. And so that's why my question is, when Democrats start pulling out religious language, my question is, who are they trying to appeal to? Because they're not going to appeal to a very large number of people. And that's not new with Trump. I mean, 81% of evangelicals, white evangelicals voted for Trump. Those numbers are consistent with the last 4 presidential elections of the percentage that voted for the Republican candidate. And it's not just religiously based. There's a lot of reasons people do that. And so just looking at one of the comments, because it's related, I don't think there's a lot of commonality between some extremely right-wing Christians and more liberal Christians sometimes. I mean, that doesn't mean we're personally malicious to people in the same way that Trump is, definitely, but we also have to realize that there's a political struggle there. We disagree politically and religiously on things and take that seriously, and what to do from that standpoint. I would also say something that's important as a means of engagement is to think locally as well. We tend to focus at the national level, and rightly so, but a lot of the issues that affect all of us on a day-to-day basis are very local issues. And being engaged in local community politics, community organizations, nonprofits, initiatives, and so on at a local level has an impact as well. I mean, I'm not the first to say it, but it would be great if a lot of these candidates running for Democratic office right now would think a little smaller, because we could use them there too.
Yeah. And I guess I would like to, I'm thinking about Russell Smith's question in the chat room right now about the possibility of finding agreement with the much maligned evangelicals in our beliefs. And I'm thinking about sort of Clayton's answer or beginning comment with regard to fascism. What I think is important, and I'm not just trying to make a plug for this book, that's why I'm so hesitant right now. But I think what's important about this book is that it tries to think about resistance in terms of intersectionality. That again, sort of politics doesn't have to be played as a zero-sum game. And so that also relates to sort of what it means to sort of be in agreement or non-agreement, or to be unified, or to sort of accept our differences, the inclusion of diversity. All these kinds of things that I think we're not really good or adept at thinking about. What we're trying to do in this book is to think about sort of resistance as a multi-pronged effort, as an effort that in some ways is that it might be at cross purposes with itself, that people come to kind of points of resistance on the local level with all kind of different kind of ideas and needs in mind, and that's perfectly okay. That instead of thinking about resistance as a kind of wholesale revolution, if we can think of ways that we can sort of engage in acts of micro-resistance, I think these are really important things. But saying all that, when I think about sort of the agreement with our much maligned evangelicals, I think the agreement, at least from the perspective of Westar, is that we are doing our best to take Scripture and religion seriously. We're trying to sort of understand the nuance of the situation that sort of gave rise to is that the ways by which people have God is opposed to the ways of
Jeff, your audio is
it's caught up in sort of the way of the world is caught up in power and domination, and the kingdom of God is a way of thinking about sort of power differently. It does not dominate. It's reciprocal. It's communal, and so yes, we want to be in conversation with our evangelical friends, but if it's going to be on the basis of Scripture, it can't be on the basis of a kind of ignorance or willful ignorance or a kind of simple-mindedness that refuses to acknowledge the kind of ambiguities and complexity of the cultural situation in which Scripture came to birth in the first place. And I think so much that Westar is sort of trying to do, and I think it's reflected in this book as well.
All right, well, just the last few minutes. Any other thoughts, Paulus or Clayton, as we wrap up?
So just about this idea of having conversations with people on the other side, whether religious or political. And I think that somebody mentioned like devolving into politics, but religion is always already political. And that's what we've shown not only in the scriptures, but also today. I mean, it's always completely. And so there's no distinction that really can be sustained. So I question the whole model of conversion. And if we think that we can convert somebody to our point of view, if we're on the left and somebody else is on the right, it's not going to work. It doesn't happen on the basis of arguments or beliefs, but it's about engaging in different ways and creating, following some of those lines of intersection, those possible coalitions, solidarities, and getting ourselves and the other beyond the either or, because we're trapped by that, and we're trapped by the media so much and the political parties in that here's the position on the right, here's the position on the left, here's the position politically, theologically, economically, whatever it is, and we need to explode all of those binaries. And if we reach out to people so-called across from the spectrum, just put those binaries aside and then see what might become possible.
Thanks. Anything else, guys? Cool. Well, thank you everyone again so much. And the replay will be able to be accessed if you want to. And I will also send it out in a link to everybody, as well as any resources that we discussed here and more info on how to join if you're not already a member, or if you're interested in doing that. And don't forget, if you do, then you get this copy, or not this exact copy because it's mine and it's underlined, but a copy of this book as an incentive. Or if you join at the $5 a month level, you'll get a chapter from the book as an incentive as well. So thanks again. And one final thing, if any of you are in like the Beaverton, Oregon general area, we're having what we call a Jesus seminar on the road that is actually very in keeping with this topic. I think it's called How the Right is Wrong or something to that effect. There's more information on the website, westarinstitute.org, and I can also put a link to that in the email that I send out. But just as we were talking, I was thinking like there's some real interesting symbiosis in what they're going to talk about and what the issues and the questions that were raised here tonight get into. So we hope to see you again on one of these in the future. And Jeff and Clayton and Hollis, thank you so much as well. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.